tu nanamu akomea tasu, ka eia kwa ki alit tasu kana. Ta'ara eia kwa ki alit tu naunamu. Ni pei imiden tamamang ki ana, ka tu eusi ki ana asi ni peiringai ta sasasat ka mamang kani peiring era.
Hello and welcome to In Taiwan We Speak, your audio guide to Taiwan's mind-blowing linguistic diversity. I am Alexander Shin, and today we will go back in history and take a look at Taiwan, its peoples and languages exactly 400 years ago. In 1624, the Dutch East India Company came ashore in Taiwan and established its presence here. The Dutch thus became the first colonial power to lay their claim over Formosa, the island that was already someone else's home. What followed were centuries of displacement, cultural erasure, and language loss for the island's indigenous peoples, as Taiwan was passed from one foreign administration to another. I am joined today by Christopher Joby, a scholar of Dutch and Spanish colonial presence and missionary work in Taiwan. Professor Joby is currently a research associate at Center of Taiwan Studies in the University of London. That's one of very few institutions outside of Taiwan that specialize in Taiwan studies. Professor Joby, it's a pleasure having you here today.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
You were on short stay in Taiwan just for several months, right?
That's right. I'm here for 5 months as a Center of Chinese Studies scholar working on Indigenous matters.
Then I have to thank you once again for finding time for us here, and welcome to RTI. That passage that you read for us in the beginning of the episode, what was that about?
That language was Siraya, and the extract comes from the first 3 verses of chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. John. That was written by Dutch missionaries together with indigenous informants in the 1650s and was printed in Amsterdam in 1661, but unfortunately never made it back to Taiwan because Zhen Gong expelled the Dutch from Taiwan in 1662, but that is an extract in the Siraya language.
What is the content of that specific part that you read for us?
Okay, so it's the first 3 verses of St. John, and it talks about the Word, the Logos, which is the kind of eternal spirit of God, which Christians believe became man in Jesus Christ. So the first verse would often read in English, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This was in the beginning with God."
This book that we're quoting today, St. John's, was actually discovered by today's guest in Europe. It was considered lost for many years. Now it's contributing towards Siraya language revitalization. We'll talk about that
Sure.
a little bit later.
Yeah.
We'll start with the basics. For most of us living here in modern-day Taiwan, it'd be quite hard to imagine what Taiwan looked like before the first colonizers arrived. And back then, before the Dutch arrived, this land was entirely in the hands of its indigenous peoples, many peoples indeed. Now, you as a researcher of that period, you perhaps know the best what it was like, at least from what we know. What did that world look like before they arrived?
That's a good question. In some ways quite similar, but in other ways different. The shape of Taiwan, the topography was more or less the same. Some land has been reclaimed, for example, in western Tainan, where there was a large bay, that's now been reclaimed. But if you were to look at a map then and a map now, it would be more or less the same shape. Obviously, there were no big towns, high-speed railways, motorways, that sort of thing. We reckon about 100,000 people would have been living in Taiwan. That is, of course, an estimate. About 20% of those would have been living in the southwestern plains in the area identified as Siraya. territory. Most of those would have been Austronesians, the people we now call Indigenous. In the 16th century, Chinese and Japanese merchants and traders began to have contact with the indigenous people to buy and sell. Taiwan's been described as a barter beach by some scholars, and indeed some villages were inhabited by Chinese merchants. It wasn't simply the indigenous Austronesians living there at this time. If we think of what the landscape, the countryside might have looked like, one thing that strikes me is that there would have been a huge amount of sika deer roaming across the plains. You'll be lucky if you see one today in Taiwan, but there would have been hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of those. The Dutch saw them as a good way of making profit because they would sell their skins, their pelts to the Japanese who liked them. So that would be one significant difference. And one other thing, I guess most travel would have been by river or sea. The Dutch do record that they were able to march across land, but whether there are things we recognise as roads is another matter.
Now, you did mention the southwestern part of Taiwan, which is where the Dutch established their first fort.
Correct.
Right, the Fort Zalandi, if I'm not mistaken.
Before they arrived in Taiwan, they had a base in the Pungu Islands. In 1622, the Dutch had tried to take Macau to establish a base in China because it was all about being able to trade with the Chinese, but the Portuguese repulsed the Dutch fleet. The Dutch fleet removed to the Pungu Islands, but then the governor of Fujian, who had control over the Pungu Islands, said, no, you can't stay there. So they did some reconnaissance missions to Taiwan in 1623, and then they had to move in 1624, and probably with some local Chinese interpreters, they worked out the best place to establish their base was on a spit of land in Taiyuan Bay, which is now Anping. So that explains why that particular part of Taiwan was one of the first to be inhabited by the Europeans.
And where across the island did indigenous people live back then? Did we have the geography of indigenous homelands that we see today on Taiwan's map? Was it more or less the same back then?
Is a very good question. If I say yes and no, that sounds as though I'm trying to get out of it, but I think yes and no. We tend to associate the Siraya these days with southwestern Taiwan, and that was where the Siraya were living. Since the Dutch colonial period, some Siraya have actually moved to eastern Taiwan, but there are still people who identify as Siraya around the Tainan area. But others have moved. For example, the Tayal, who live in Wulai.
Near Taipei.
Correct, near Taipei. They originally came from higher up in the mountains in central Taiwan, but during the Qing period moved down or northwards towards Wulai and then onto Taiyuan. There have been movements since the Dutch period. Some have stayed more or less in about the same place. The Dutch referred to the Puyuma and we know they lived in southeastern Taiwan at that time. If the Japanese colonial administration moved some peoples for various reasons, but there are also people who've more or less stayed in the same place. The term Siraya, for example, is one that isn't there at the start in the Dutch sources, but kind of emerges. So the various villages that are now identified as Siraya were at war with each other quite regularly. There were headhunting expeditions between villages within the same ethnic groups. I don't know much about wars between ethnic groups, but I can imagine that there would have been some. There were certainly wars and headhunting expeditions within the same ethnic groups.
We've previously had a guest on this show who's from the Taukas indigenous nation. He did mention an interesting thing about a certain formation that existed when the Dutch arrived, the Kingdom of Dadu.
I've seen that on a map. I haven't included that in my research, but yeah, I've seen that marked on a map.
Do you know anything about that political formation, if we can call it, a union of tribes?
Another one is Longjiao in the south of Taiwan, in the Dutch records, there's reference to a prince, a vorst of Longjiarangzhou in Mandarin. This prince was the ruler of some 16 villages, and each of those villages had a chief. That's quite a different political formation to, for example, the Siraya. All the Siraya villages were independent, and they didn't have chiefs as such. They had councils of elders. There were different political formations, and they were constantly forming and breaking political alliances. One of the reasons why the village of Shinkan was particularly keen to welcome the Dutch was because Shinkan was relatively small compared to other Siraya villages, and they saw, it is a good move to have the Dutch as their ally so that they could deal with larger villages such as Matau.
If we talk about Siraya people and all other people that were there first ones to see the Dutch arriving, I know you've written extensively about what those people believed in, what they even ate. Do share with us what kind of lifestyles they led.
In terms of belief, the Siraya seem to have had quite a complex series of beliefs. They certainly believed in a spirit world, a world of spirits. We might call that animism, where the trees and the rocks were inhabited by spirits. The birds of the air were inhabited by spirits. Divination played an important part in their lives, where they'd work out from the movement of a bird whether they should go hunting or not, or where they should hunt. And most, if not all, of the indigenous groups that I've studied practiced divination, be it through birds or through bamboo or other objects. So that was an important part of it. What's particularly distinctive about the Siraya is they also had a pantheon of gods. If we compare that with the Tayal, there's no evidence that they had a pantheon of gods, say a god of rain or a god of thunder or a god of war. There was a Scottish employee of the VOC called David Wright who wrote quite an extensive ethnography of the Siraya. He mentioned 13 gods in the Siraya pantheon. That makes us think, why is that? Why do the Siraya have gods, whereas other groups don't? That's a bit about religion. We can talk more about that. In terms of food, the staple foods were millet and rice. Interestingly, the Siraya don't seem to have cultivated millet, which distinguishes them from some of the other groups. Pork was important. Some things just haven't changed. Killing pigs, slaughtering pigs was an important part of a lot of the ceremonies of the Siraya, as indeed it is of other indigenous groups. Fish, fruit, and of course alcohol. There's a word list that we have from the Dutch period which gives various names for different types of alcohol. They had quite an advanced way of making different types of alcohol, and obviously these would be drunk at certain ceremonies or just of an evening.
Do you know how strong was the alcohol?
I can't give figures, but certainly strong, enough to become intoxicated on, which was part of the point. And there was an example of some of the Dutch being offered some of the alcohol, but actually refusing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, possibly out of their Calvinist convictions, but perhaps also they didn't want to lose control in the way that they were seeing the Siraya doing through drinking alcohol.
Now, you've mentioned that at that moment, indigenous peoples across the island had already been trading with the Chinese, with the Japanese. But do we know what the encounter of indigenous peoples and Sirayans in specific with the Dutch was like?
Specifically the Siraya and the Dutch.
That very encounter that now is sort of considered as the beginning of that 400 years old history of Tainan in specific.
There were different reactions, probably on both sides. The first governor of Dutch Formosa, looked down on the indigenous people. He saw them as savages, basically. But the first missionary, Georgius Candidius, likened the eloquence of some of the Siraya to Demosthenes, the great Athenian. Now, whether that was a move to get more money to keep the mission going, maybe, maybe not. But he didn't just dismiss them. He actually went and built a bamboo hut and did his mission work in Shinkan. So there were different reactions from the Dutch side. That's probably also true of the Siraya. The problem is we don't have written sources from the Siraya. On the one hand, they probably saw them as useful allies in their fight against Matau, but on the other hand, they may have been moved by Candidus's kindness and his willingness to engage with them. So there was probably a mixture of reactions. One of the challenges when you're studying indigenous people, particularly when they haven't left any written sources, is to try and work out, well, what was actually going on. You're looking at a certain event or bit of history through different lenses and trying to work out what was happening there can be problematic.
Once the Dutch established their first fort in the Tainan area, nowadays Tainan, then what followed in between the Dutch and the Sirayan people?
Sometimes they made progress in terms of trading with them, but other times there were problems. One big problem was involving the village of Matau. The Dutch wanted to take control of that because they realised if they could control Matau, then they could control the whole Siraya area. A group of Dutch soldiers was massacred by the Matauers in 1629, 1630. It took the Dutch about 5 years to have enough troops to take revenge. They carried out revenge expeditions and basically, bring Matau under their control. The Matauers then offered the Dutch some of their plants in their soil, as if to say, okay, our land is now your land. But by about 1635, the Dutch had political control of the Siraya villages and then could try to expand beyond that to southern Taiwan and into the Favalang area in modern-day Yunlin County. The Dutch were encouraging Chinese to settle from Fujian because they realised that they worked hard and obviously that would help them fund their colony. But some indigenous people felt that the Chinese were infringing on their right to hunt and they would sometimes kill Chinese, and then the Dutch would come and carry out retribution. By about 1644, the Dutch had taken control of the Favalang territory. So by about 1650, the Dutch had control of most of the western coast or plains of Taiwan. And also, but in 1642, they expelled the Spanish. The Spanish had established a colony in northern Taiwan based at Keelung. But in 1642, the Dutch kicked them out. So they were able to take control of the north of Taiwan, pretty much where we're sitting now.
We don't hear a lot about the Spanish presence in Taiwan as much as we do about the Dutch, right? I mean, it's fair to say that the Dutch have left their mark on this country, on its indigenous peoples. How will they be remembered, though?
Well, that's an interesting question. As you said in your introduction, this year is the 400th anniversary, if we can call it that, of the arrival of the Dutch. And I would say the memory is a mixed one. On the one hand, they developed international trading routes around Taiwan. That kind of put Taiwan in the middle of these transcontinental trading routes. There were ships stopping off here, going from Indonesia to Japan and back. Obviously, there were ships coming from China to Taiwan as well. In that sense, Taiwan for that period became part of an international trade network. The Dutch also began the development of the land, whereas previously the indigenous people just grew enough to feed themselves. The Dutch wanted farming to be profitable. And so what they did was to rent out land to Chinese tenant farmers. The tenant farmers would have to pay the Dutch for that privilege and then pay a tax on what they produced. And the Dutch word for that is pachten, and that went into Hokkien as pa. So that system of tenant farming was continued by the Zheng regime and then the Qing regime. On the negative side, it was the start of Taiwan being colonized. And if you go to the fort in Tamshui, the Red Hare Fort, you see these various flags of the colonizing powers, one after another in Taiwan, and the Dutch one is the first. So from a colonial or post-colonial studies perspective, then obviously it wasn't particularly a positive thing.
Well, with that, we've run towards the end of the first part of our interview for today, but we do not end our chat with Professor Christopher Joby here just yet. Join us next week as we continue our conversation about Taiwan's indigenous history and early colonial history in Taiwan. Thank you, Professor Joby, and thank you everyone for tuning in. My name is Oleg. See you next week.